So welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a good lunch. I have my windows open and the cicadas are now singing. Hopefully that won't be too loud. If you hear them, let me know. I don't think you have them in New England, do you? The cicadas?
Nope.
Nope. Okay.
Just crickets.
We have cicadas, but we don't have the
17-year.
10. Yeah, we don't have those. Yeah.
Anyway, we're going to keep talking about relevance to community, and a person that has written a good deal about it is Nina Simon. And if you haven't heard of her, she is in California. I don't know where she lives at the moment, but she used to be director of the San Jose Art Museum. So she wrote a book called The Art of Relevance a number of years ago. And we're going to be looking at some quotes from that book. We may agree with what she says, we may not agree, but just note that she comes with an art museum lens. So that's kind of how she looks at it. Relevance. This is one of her quotes. You can read there. We're going to look at, I think, 4 more of her quotes that are juicier than this one. And we're going to divide into 4 groups and go into 4 rooms. So Richard's going to facilitate that. And the next slide has, so actually in your handouts, you should look for a page that has all the quotes on. So if you can find that page, pull that up. And it has groups listed. So we're going to just take a few minutes in different groups talking about the quote. And each group has a different quote. Richard, are you?
So what we're going to do right now is set you all up into 4 breakout groups, and then we'll get you all set up. Room 1 will be group 1. Room 2 will be group 2. Room 3, group 3. Room 4, group 4. And as Tim is saying, let's take a look at these. These quotes. And Tim, remind us, what's sort of the big sort of piece we want them to come back to kind of talk about?
So they all relate to relevance to some degree. So what do you think? I guess the main question is, what do you think what do they say about relevance in our settings?
Cool. And we're gonna give you all till about, well, we want to finish this activity at about 2:10. So I think we probably want to go for maybe 15 minutes.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Okay, cool. And I'll give you.
You may or may not agree. It's okay not to agree with what she says.
Cool. And I'll give you all a kind of a 5-minute warning. You'll get a broadcast message that says, "Hey, got 5 minutes left." So with that, let's start these rooms up.
You should just get put into one. I think.
Yep. And so I will stop the share now, actually. So yeah, we've gonna open all the rooms right now. There we go. And
Tim going to 1. Oh, he's in 3.
Yeah. Okay, let me go to 3 and get him. All right.
Or actually, you can move him out. I think there's the option to move him.
Okay, there he is. Move him to the main session. There we go.
Did it not pull him out?
Well, I think what it does is it gives him, the notice. I'm just hoping he sees it and clicks on it. There it is. So Tim, down on the bottom of your screen, do you have a button that says breakout rooms?
No.
It might be under the more section.
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, let me pause the recording.
Hopefully you all had a good, interesting conversation. Richard, can you get the PowerPoint slide up?
Yes.
So each group focused on a different quote. So we can, we'll go through the different quotes, 4 different quotes. And if a group wants to share a little bit about their conversation or something they learned or really struggled with, that would be great. We can start with group 1. Anyone from group 1 want to say anything about their quote?
I don't mind sharing the last questions that I just brought to the group.
Yeah.
So one of the things that kind of struck me based on some other comments that folks in the group had mentioned was this like tricky positionality that we have of balancing when something is relevant to ourselves individually and when something is relevant to our institution. And in reading this particular quote, because it's directed towards whoever the reader is with the word you, there's that trickiness of like, should we be reading this as us individuals or as us as an institution, which is a larger question. When are we part of an institution or not? And when are we ourselves and can we be that? But then the other piece is that I started thinking about was like, if this is directed to the institution, like, is it possible for an institution to really be relevant to everyone? Or is it more so that relevance happens and like the evaluation of relevance happening, whatever that means, is really interpersonal work and relational work. And so in that last part where it says it brings new value to the table, clearly value is something that's important. Relevancy, it lends itself to thinking, okay, relevancy is important, but how do we measure that value? And so part of me is thinking that there's a key somewhere in like interpersonal programming and relational programming and partnerships there. And I don't know, that's kind of where I'm stuck, but like, how do we evaluate that value?
Thanks, Olivia. Any other thoughts from group 1? Should we move to group 2? So give everyone a minute to read those quotes. Anyone in group 2 want to tell us a little about your conversation?
We really like the empathy part of it. We agreed that trying to put ourselves in the minds of, or the shoes, or whatever you want to say, of other people and figure out what is of interest and importance to them is a valuable exercise. And we also talked a bit about not if it was different than what was important to us, not necessarily pandering to them and only feeding them things that would be of interest to them, but finding a balance between what's important to us and what's important to the people we hope will engage with us. And I'll let somebody else go from there.
We talked a little bit about how this applies not only for public work, but also internally, and like how we can use empathy in order to like create that hook for our colleagues and volunteers and our board and things like that in a way that was like a helpful framing for us.
I think these are the only quotes that mention empathy.
I find something very interesting in this one, especially on the second part. When it talks about this tension between evangelizing the things you care about and listening with interest to what others care about, that there's this place in between those that I think it makes sense for us to really be mindful of. And it's, you know, while I evangelize the things that I care about and I'm listening to the things that you care about, at some degree, I also need to challenge myself to be open to changing my thoughts about the things that I'm evangelizing about. You know, sometimes you know, you can get simple empathy by, you know, saying, hey, this is what I care about and listen to other people. I think where it becomes even more interesting is that when we're listening to what others care about and they're listening to us and we're open to be able to explore an area that isn't my point or their point, that we're exploring something that's maybe not as much, maybe it's a compromise or they're not, but just leaving room to be open to change your mind or to grow your thoughts seems to be super important in that space.
I think it's also important to acknowledge that that may not be a comfortable space. And, you know, like, I think we often look for the resolution that's going to give everyone some sort of serenity or harmony or resolution. The answer may be that for a while we have to be uncomfortable and just accept it.
Yeah, good point. And speaking of which, before we end today, a friend of mine sent me an article. He knows I'm into behavioral science. And he sent me an article just recently that spoke to the ways in which people change their minds or change their thoughts. And I reviewed the article and thought like, wow, like knowing this information, whatever text that I'm writing for a panel or whatever program that I'm presenting, I would definitely consider these things in mind if these are the touch points that you know, increases the potential of people being able to change their minds. If I knew that secret, then I would design programs to write things a bit differently. And this article kind of opened my mind to that. So as we go through, I'm gonna pull that up and share that with y'all in the chat because I just thought it was very interesting and something to consider.
Can I just wanted to jump in on that second and probably the opposite, Richard, of what you were saying in some way, but so many organizations that I work with are afraid to be bold about their leadership, afraid to be bold about what they care about. And, you know, what I believe about our sector, not just in the humanities or in the cultural world, but in the nonprofit sector in general, is that it's a servant leadership, but where the leadership part is about taking people to places they never thought they would ever have thought to go to, or they didn't even know about, at the same time that you're serving them. And so it's that listening and understanding, but also putting new stuff out there, new ideas, new thoughts, new ways, you know, taking a stand, doing all of those things that I think are important as well.
Just want to say I agree with that.
Should we move on to group 3? So here are the quotes from 3. Did you all agree with these or not?
I think it's challenging to make something relevant to everyone. So the statement, you can make something relevant to anyone, perhaps so. I suspect it would be very challenging if you had a group of anyones and had to make something relevant to each one of these anyones all at the same time.
Yeah, we also started out, group 3 started out doubting that as well, but then I think it was Betsy then sort of reeled off like 5 ways to make Russian icons relevant. So I think if you've got some education ninjas in your group, you can make it happen, is kind of the lesson I learned there.
Huh.
I think that getting to the finite example that Carol brought up by saying, well, how would you make an icon interesting and relevant? And you can talk about as adoration, you can talk about grief, you can talk about craftsmanship. You make some connection to some universality. The second section, we also thought, I'm not sure we reached consensus, which is fine. Instead of asking about your institution, which says this conversation is about me, ask questions about what they find relevant, which seems to be the conversation is about you. And I think that appeals to more people and is more open in a way, a more open-ended question.
Yeah, and going back to this morning, we also talked about how this is easier probably for those institutions that do engage in dialogue with their visitors. You know, they probably are more in touch with what's relevant to the people who come to see them than museums that have a more, you know, traditional model.
And Gail brings up a very good point in the chat that I think I appreciate you putting it there, because it's a reminder for all of this that we talk about. That when we talk about relevance, we're often talking about, you know, the internal mechanisms. We're also talking about the community, and we're talking about, you know, the audience. But one of the blind spots that I recognize for me is thinking about, you know, funders and fundraising and the grants and you know, that whole process. You know, requires as much of a level of connection and relevance as anything else. And so anytime that we haven't mentioned them today, I just want to acknowledge them right here and now and say, yeah, we talk about them too. And I appreciate that reminder, Gail. Thank you.
Any final thoughts from group 3? Let's move to 4.
I thought the bigger question here isn't, can an organization pursue relevance without grounding in the mission, but should the organization do that? If it's not possible to pursue relevance within the mission, I would think that it's time to update the mission. I just think that knowing who you are and what you're about, which should be what your mission gives you, is really important, and that it's confusing to external folks and your constituents if you're moving too far outside of the mission.
How often has your mission changed at your institution?
So I've been with my organization, Old North Church, for just about a year, so I don't have a long background there. But we are in the process of updating our mission right now. Although my colleague Catherine may know the last time that it was updated.
Not in my 10, 12, 14 years. Yeah.
You have a unique mix of visitors, I guess. You have a lot of national US visitors who walk the Freedom Trail, right?
Yeah.
Probably not as many local visitors. I don't know, maybe you do, but.
Local visitors tend to be families, or, you know, most people who grew up in Boston or in New England have come here, you know, as children at some point. I mean, in terms of our visitors, we certainly attract folks from all across the political spectrum. And we're in a time where everything feels partisan. Talking about active citizenship is like a loaded thing now. So relevance is tough for us. And I think we are getting to a place where we're comfortable saying, you know, we do have a point of view. And if folks aren't happy with that, maybe they won't spend as much time with us, and that's okay.
Any other thoughts from this group?
We also, I don't know, Marie, do you want to say anything, or Meredith?
I guess one of the things we really discussed was kind of relevance, both externally and internally, and almost laterally, with like relevance to peers, like in the field, relevance. I know, you know, just since we spoke, I've been thinking a lot about at my institution, in our building, where we're made up of 2 institutions and various contractors, is everyone aware of the same mission? Like, are we all on the same mission, actually? Like, is that being communicated even internally, so then it can be externally manifested in a more like consistent manner? And with that, you know, one of the things that was brought up by one of the other people in my group was just this, when you're talking internally versus externally, of like, and I think actually one of the other codes kind of talks about this, the insiderness of things versus needing to really like ask the question of like whoever is not currently already like on the board or members, like that's a different, making the case of relevance can look very different, and that it requires real internal like looking at the mission and being willing to have your mission revisited and maybe reworked.
And just add that we also spoke about community. So what is community? How do you define it? And thinking of community, you know, beyond visitorship or even beyond local area, but is this sense of kind of who are we morally accountable to? Like, who is our community? And that's not necessarily static, right? And there may be multiples in there.
So now we're gonna switch gears a little bit and go into the third realm of relevance, kind of, which is the individual. How do you make it relevant? I know a few of you have expressed your challenges in making your site relevant. You just feel like it's not, the content area, I guess, isn't fitting in with maybe your community or just with what is going on these days. And so we're going to do an exercise again in small groups. I was fortunate to do a workshop on relevance at the Shaker community in Pleasant Hill, Kentucky, which is what these pictures are from. I know you have some Shaker sites in New England as well. If you know anything about the Shakers, the question is, how do you make a group of celibate furniture makers relevant to today's culture, right? And A lot of people are fascinated in the Shakers because maybe of their furniture or their utopian lifestyle or whatever. But the challenge, of course, is how do you make them relevant? So that's what this exercise is. And if you want to pull out from your packet, there's a sheet of text that starts with the Shakers, and it's an info sheet all about the Shakers. So if you don't know anything about the Shakers, fear not. So the goal of this is really Betsy's comments from a few minutes ago were a great setup to this, because we're getting at the fascinating versus relevant and that spectrum of it. And it's really about universality, which is what she was mentioning. And we've probably all gone on historic house tours where they point out all the decorative arts in the house, and you kind of leave thinking, well, so what? Why should I care about this? I had a personal example. I happened to be going by a presidential site in upstate New York that is owned by the Park Service. I won't say which one. But it was not a president I knew much about. It was one of those obscure presidents. And I just happened to be going by it. And I thought, well, I wouldn't have stopped and see a presidential house. But I took the tour and it was really interesting to see the house. And I learned a little bit about the president, but I had to ask, so what? And so at the end of the tour, I took the park ranger aside and I said, this was interesting, thanks, but I have to ask, what do you say if someone says, so what? Why should I care about this president? And she had a hard time answering me, and I thought that's not a good sign. You should be able to answer why your topic is of importance to anyone who comes through the door. So anyway, so this activity, we'll talk about the Shakers. Pull out your sheet. So what I want each group to do is to make a list of the universals. We sometimes, because we're history people, can get caught into the trap of having to say so many facts. These are the top 10 facts you must convey on every tour you give. Like, you can imagine someone at the Shaker Village saying, you know, people need to leave knowing that the Shakers were believed in this, were founded this, stopped practice at this time, you know, facts. But what happens, as one of my colleagues said, what would happen if you didn't give facts, but only gave themes, talked in themes, universal themes? Would that make your topic more relevant? So hopefully you all understand what the exercise is. So in your groups, read this, take a minute to read this long information about the Shakers, and then talk about the overall universal themes. Make a list of universal themes that you could talk about that visitors could get engaged with the Quakers in that way. Any questions? So well, Richard, will we go into the same groups? Do you know?
No, I mean, I'm just gonna put everybody in different groups.
Okay.
And looking at the time now, we've got 2:23. So what time do we want to bring everybody back?
Give them, we want to talk about this a little bit. Give them 15 minutes, I guess, at the most.
15 minutes?
12 minutes or so.
Okay, cool. All right, let me stop the share.
We have a slide of it too, but I think everyone should have it.
And this should be new groups. There we go.
I'm going to try to share my screen and make a list. So share. Oh, let's see, text box. Okay, let's just throw out some of the themes that you talk about. We'll make a list. Just start giving me some examples.
Community and family.
Okay, why is it? Okay, keep going.
Religious freedom and self-expression.
Okay.
Efficiency and simplicity of domestic life.
Okay.
Music and dance.
We talked about chosen communities as opposed to things that you're raised into. And also expressing values, your societal values through architecture.
That's a good one.
Keep them coming. There are a lot more.
Mysticism and artistry.
Gender roles.
Yeah, that's a big one.
You could also put gender roles and sexuality, because we talked about how many people might have been potentially queer and just kind of living in a solid society.
We were kind of thinking about environmental impact, the
Yeah.
sort of mode of life and its relative greenness.
Technology to some degree, because how they produced their goods and how they marketed them.
One of the groups, I can't remember which one, was saying that she thought the Shakers would have been great with eBay and Amazon and internet technology. Who was saying that?
That would have been me, yes. Because they were really good at marketing their furniture and the other things they produced, and they were looking for new ways to do things. That's what made me say that they were, yeah.
Right.
We also talked about the differences between spirituality and religion. Or organized religion, I guess.
We also talked about craftsmanship and aesthetic.
We expanded on the community and family idea a little bit and talked about altruism and the generosity, the component of taking those in who were in difficult life circumstances as part of their code.
Did you say altruism?
More of an altruistic perspective.
Okay. I don't know how to spell that. Altruistic.
And relating to that, a bit about immigration and migration and why some people ended up there because they were in need of a safe space.
Yeah, that's a good one. Or just why people end up in the communities they do. Maybe.
Along those lines, we were talking about sort of different visions of what a utopian or communal society looks like and kind of different ways people have approached that and how that might look now in terms of like artist communes and, you know, co-ops and things like that.
That's interesting.
We also had the question of, or I guess I had the question where I was thinking about if I taught students Shakers today, if they would just ask me if this is a cult or not. I know it seems silly, but like, I think it's a good question. Like, what does that mean? What does that entail? Maybe it's around mission-based living. And what does it mean to create your own mission and your own political views kind of separate?
Just to hook onto the utopia in our group, we also talked about dystopia, right? So here was this place that following its natural progression without conversion would disappear and did.
Although Gail brought up a really interesting point about sort of the denouement, the end of the Shakers, and how there was questions about legacy and inheritance for some of the very final members.
Have there been any dystopian novels set in Shaker villages, I wonder?
Well, there are a number of dystopian stories about worlds without children, but specifically about Shakers, I have no idea.
Although they did have children, right? I mean, there were children there, I
Right.
believe.
Families came in from the
Right.
outside, yeah.
Yeah.
We were talking about the children were raised by the group and not by their own biological parents, so.
That could be a topic, children itself. So the point is, are these big enough universals that we could interest people that would visit a Shaker village and not be, like, maybe be dragged along by their friends who are fascinated by Shakers, but we want to engage those people that were dragged there. And sometimes if you use universals, you have a better chance of engaging more people. Would you agree with that? Richard, let's see, go back to the slide. Do I have to unshare, I think? Yes. Stop share. So let's get the next slide up. So if you think of your content, again, this is very content focused, but if you think about it as a continuum between facts, which history people tend to love, and themes, you know, where is your site on that continuum as far as what you focus on? And what is your default? Do you default to facts? So if you're giving a house tour, is it always about the furniture or whatever? Or do you try to talk about themes? Anyone want to share if their organization has thought about this?
I feel like we're always thematically based, and I think it's great until sometimes you actually need to give facts. And I think sometimes art museums can learn about what it means to provide just some concrete facts to help people's thinking, you know, that historic sites do well. But yeah, we always start with themes for everything, exhibitions, et cetera, for like pedagogically thinking.
And you're at an art museum, right?
Yeah. Children's museums are the same way too. I used to work at children's museums.
Well, what about you history folks? Would you say you start with themes or you don't start with themes? Or have you not thought about this before?
At the grist mill that I manage here in Virginia, as I'm thinking about this, we do themes with school groups, but we do facts with the general public when they come in on weekends.
That's
Not
very
why.
interesting. That's very interesting. And one would ask why that is.
Exactly. I gotta think about that.
When I worked for the National Park Service, I felt like they did it really well because we were given kind of a set of like, these are the facts you have to convey, but then we were encouraged to write our own tour to a theme that spoke to us. So I was working at Longfellow's, the Longfellow National Historic Site in Cambridge. And so I was talking about how Longfellow, as in his role as a poet, was a real creator of history, and how so much of like our sense of American history is part of this like created past and his role in that. So like there was still all the like, and these were his kids, and this is what happened to his first wife, and this is what happened to his second wife, and all of that. But it was all wrapped up in his poems and this theme about like how he was a creator of memory. So I thought that was really fun. And everybody all the rangers had different tours because everybody was working with different themes.
So I guess the point is to find your place on this continuum, and balance is probably the best approach, but often you can engage more people with themes, maybe. Any other comments on this? I want to go to the next slide. I can't remember what the next slide is. Oh, okay. I think we're good to move to this, right, Richard?
Sure. Let me pull back my page real quick. So as we, in this history relevance movement, we were starting to think about, how to think about an experience, and by what means might we think about. For me, it was thinking about how I might measure whether something is relevant or not. But I think we got to a bigger sort of conversation in terms of just how do we identify, these sort of characteristics or these qualities of a relevant history, a history experience. And so we got to come up with some language in terms of, relevant history experience is one in which the audience and the institution connect through responsive and applicable programs that are both timely and rooted in historical quality. And I'll just kind of point y'all to this graphic so we can just talk a little bit, or just hear some of your feedback. So that we think that, anytime you think about an experience and you're thinking about it being, falling under this banner of being relevant, then there's 5 key things that we want to think about. How well is it
Let me
pushing?
just say for a minute that this is in your packet as well.
Gotcha, thank you. How well is it, doing a job of, making the connections? How good is it at being responsive? At times that response is to what society is talking about at a time, or maybe it's just something that's going on within the community, but how is it responding to, whatever it is that's going on that makes it relevant? How applicable it is, how current and timely it is, and also being sure that it's rooted in historical quality. So especially when we look at this, the slide that had this sort of continuum, or a continuum spectrum, this facts and these themes. The more I think about that, the more I find myself kind of moving, not necessarily being static in one of these, but moving in between, different ones throughout the course of an experience that I'm, writing or pulling together or whatnot. So, connected, responsive, applicable, current and timely, rooted in historical quality. I'll tell y'all that there was a 6th. We had a 6th that we talked about, and that was memorable. And as we, did this workshop before and had conversations with people, we felt like memorable, some aspects of memorable just really didn't necessarily apply to this sort of idea of relevancy. But then other aspects of, the memorableness of an experience are found in these other areas of being connected, of being rooted in historical quality and the like. So I'd like to hear your thoughts as to, what do y'all think? Is this seems like a good list? You think we missing something?
I think current and timely sometimes trips people up because they think, well, if it's history, it's not current and timely. And that's
Right.
not what that means. It means you can select topics that are in the news today that have a long history, that might have a history connected to your site or your organization, your collections.
Good point. What do y'all think? If you're looking at an experience that maybe you do, or you're putting together, or even if you're visiting an organization, and seeing their experience, is this a lens by which you might be able to look through to, assess how relevant it may be?
Yeah, I would put something else is about the overall kind of the pleasantness of the experience itself kind of makes how memorable it is. I mean, it's the quality of the product itself, you know, how it resonates, you know, how it connects to the themes, the how I can apply it to my life, but it's also how I respond to it. So there is multiple things, but it has to be a pleasant experience too. The kind of almost the I'll say the physical or the emotional part of it as well.
So maybe like scaffolded.
Yeah, I mean, using
Yeah.
the educational model. Yeah.
One of the biggest challenges we had in thinking about what makes a relevant experience was isolating relevance, separating relevance out from a good education experience. Our initial list, we had things that were just a quality, strong museum education experience. But we kept saying, well, how is relevance different from just a good education experience?
I'm smiling because I remember that conversation. That I remember Tim was the one who actually asked that question, and we all paused for a moment and was like, yeah, yeah, yeah. We started trying to wrap our heads around it again, but that's a really great question. Something that we still kind of, you know, still kind of ruminating in many ways.
And the point of this is just to provide another tool for people who are trying to grapple with what relevance is.
I noticed that on the handout, you have impactful but not responsive. Is your thinking evolved
Yeah.
in how to frame this?
Did I get an old sheet, or did you, Richard?
I can't right now. I can't remember. This has been like what, 2 years. I can't remember which term. I think we actually centered on responsive, because we were concerned about the connotations that can be associated with being impactful. You know, like there's a weirdness that I remember us feeling, and and I think it was also some feedback too that kind of led us to being more responsive.
You can all go to historyrelevance.com and there's a copy there that you can download. Actually, I can go now and see.
Sorry, can I just ask a clarifier on quality? Like, I know you said I just rooted in historical quality. I'm just trying to think, like, does that include multiple perspectives or
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's also why that language is the way it is, because we wanted to raise it up high enough so that we were talking about the levels, the varying levels of authenticity within the narrative, and how that authenticity is, like, we want to elevate our thinking to not place written facts by people who had leisure and time to write as being more dominant than the oral traditions and the personal truths that come out as well, that they're equally important, and they're all incorporated under this idea of historical quality, being rooted in historical quality. This also gets into a funk in and how do we deal with memory when memory at times isn't a reflection. It's, you know, memory may prompt a valid, it may be valid, but it may not be accurate, and how we negotiate and reconcile that with the sort of fact finding mindset is one that we've really got to kind of wrap our heads around.
Is the question like, how do we know what we know? Kind of like a good equity prime for that, or no?
I think so, but I think, you know, an even deeper question for me is how do we how do we get to a point to accept, the things that we don't know? That may be coming from multiple sources. It may come from a book that we read, but it also may come from an elder that we've never heard of.
Right.
And getting to a point where we can see all of that as being of quality.
A couple of things that come to mind for me is with what you just said right now about how to accept what you don't know. I think for me, some of the most relevant or impactful like examples have been when history is discussed as a process instead of a product. And specifically recently, not that recently because the last year is a blur, but a couple years ago now, I guess, I had a family member visit. And so, they're here for a small period of time. I was like, okay, we're doing the Boston tour, walking tour, like it's happening. And in that, and I don't know if it's been so long that I haven't been, but one of the most memorable things was when they stopped at the John Hancock gravesite and then talked about the individual who, I believe he was Black. And there's this like strange relationship of like, was he a servant? Was he a slave? And they talked about everything they don't know about him. Everything that like, there is no answer to, how little the small things that we do know are known through John Hancock's records. So like how many fallacies can be in that, how many, like what kind of questions. And I just found that to be like a really powerful engagement with really like high level history, but done in a really like manageable and wonderful way of really like engaging a general public in how history is a constructed process. And a process that can change with more information and with new viewpoints and with better understandings of like individualized humanity. And so so that, and then I think one of the things of like it being relevant and impactful, I think so many of your 5 qualities require like they are back and forth. They kind of like deconstruct a bit of the authoritarian of like, we are historic site, we are expert, we are knowledge giver. And it much more requires a dialogue between the visitor and the institution, a give and take. And so I find those 5 qualities really interesting to be able to really analyze that power structure.
You just said something that was really dope that I want to accentuate, and that is, I heard someone else, Melanie Adams, who was at the Minnesota Historical Society with me. Now she's at the Anacostia Museum in DC. But she stated something one time in a meeting, or actually we were having lunch, and she said it would be really cool if our institutions began to do the types of experiences that you're talking about, where it's we're not gonna spend this whole 90-minute tour talking about how great Thomas Jefferson was. We're gonna spend this 90-minute tour telling you about what it is that we know about him, and we're also going to explore the things that we don't know and what are some possibilities. And then what we're subtly doing is showing people how we do what we do. We're making them history detectives, and so then it becomes even more. And she said the thing that would help maybe is help people to be a little more critical to what memes we're responding to online, or how we think about the types of things that come out on Facebook or Twitter, and work those things through. So I just wanted to just accentuate that idea, because I think that's really cool to have guests as part of that sort of exploration process, and know, how do we know what we know? How do we come to terms with those? But then also have them part of this exploring these sort of gray areas, the things that we create as interpretations, that aren't necessarily, grounded in fact. I worked at Williamsburg. Williamsburg has many things that are now become fact from interpretations 10 years ago.
That's one of the topics I'm very interested in, is historical teaching and what historical thinking and what is the informal learning environment's responsibility. We can't leave it up to teachers to teach historical thinking skills. And I've led several sessions at ASLH about what does it look like for us as public history organizations to teach historical thinking? How do we do that in exhibits and programs? It's really what you said, Maria. It's pulling back the curtain on process and showing how we arrive at the conclusions we arrive at and what we don't know. I happen to think that people, I mean, we all know people that don't understand that history is all interpretation. They are based on facts, but there's a lot of interpretation, and you try to change some facts based on new evidence and they accuse you of revisionist history when they don't understand that a lot of history is revising based on the evidence at hand or new evidence. Or so I think we all need to do a better job at helping people understand what historical thinking is, the process. So that's why when you look at the value of history statement, one of the values is critical thinking. It teaches critical thinking.
Good point.
Because I would also say a lot of us who got into history did so because we tend to like the research process. We like looking at the source materials and drawing conclusions. But then what we're doing with visitors is we're just sharing the conclusions. We're not sharing our excitement and digging around in the sources and comparing sources. And so we're kind of losing, we're not sharing that excitement with them that we had in the source materials, unless we show the source materials and compare source materials. So, but it takes space to do that in an exhibit, and it takes time on a tour to do that, to get into that. So
I think what I would add to that is just how much the digital age also like needs to be engaged with in this like search for relevance and reevaluation, because if we are just a place that people go to get the facts they can Google, then like there's a lot less need for people to not just jump on their phone. And so I think that the 5 qualities you've laid out allow for more of that enhancement that needs to be taking place.
Betsy, did you have a comment or question?
I was just thinking, you know, I was a history teacher, and the historical method, of course, is something that very near and dear to me, that people understand it as a process, and it's a method that we can learn of analysis that will enlighten. And how do you do that in a museum setting? I'm also a museum teacher, though, with the Isabella Gardner Museum, and we are instilled with the VTS philosophy, the visual thinking philosophy. There is no better way to analyze a primary source than to use VTS. And instead of trying to give all of these themes by tying everything together, looking at one object and having the students just really, really analyze using VTS can bring you to a theme. And at the end, the kids did it themselves. And that is a very, very important thing. So I think using the different methodologies, somebody just put something about the science, and that's why I've often thought history and the scientific method were very similar. That by overlapping these different disciplines, you can really come up to some of the solutions.
Are you doing that with adults though, or just school tours?
You know, with adults, you kind of sneak into it. You don't say, okay, everybody, we're going to look at this, and it sounds like a game, and you're insulting them. And somebody already commented, adults like facts, and I think that's true. But midway through, if somebody says something, all you have to do is turn and say, what do you see that makes you say that? And the next thing you know, you're doing VTS with adults, and they don't even know how they got there.
Great point. And I'll say that I know of an institution, I don't think it was Minnesota Historical Society, but it was somewhere in the Midwest, where they took a school program and I don't know, grew it up, if you will, for an audience, for an adult audience. And because we were working off, because they were working off of they were trying to work against the assumption that adults just want facts. And they had, had gobs of feedback and data and whatnot. And so they took a school group program and made it, use that as the foundation for an adult program. And the changes they made were very little. It was just more so in terms of presentation, what language they used and whatnot. And it became one of the best programs. And so I think you're right. I think there is something to be said about, how we can use those strategies, the VTS strategies, for adults. Sometimes in some places you'll have to sneak it in there, but in other places, I think, there are more and more adults who are actually looking for, more of the hands-on history, type of approach.
If you're not familiar with Sam Weinberg, Historical Thinking and Other Unnatural Acts, it's been out for a good maybe 10 years or more now, but he has a sequel to it as well. But he's focused on the formal learning, but it applies a lot to informal learning. So I think we debuted this, it says 2020 on it. So we also went through a year period of about sharing this and getting comment from the field. So I think it came out last spring. Am I remembering correctly, Richard, or was it? I think it was 2020.
Yeah, 2020. We started in 2019, it came out in 2020. And I think you're right, it was last spring.
So we're always open to your thoughts about it if you have questions or want to give feedback. What are we gonna do now, Richard? We have 15 minutes left. Should we try to do the last activity together and see if anyone wants to offer an idea or a topic?
Yeah, that sounds great. With the 15 minutes that we got left, we might just leave it open for, people to get any responses to anything that they heard or any, further questions.
If anyone has a burning challenge related to relevance that they just can't wrap their head around and would love the group to brainstorm ideas, now would be a time to share that. Anyone?
It's not a brainstorm question per se, but I'm just curious because, like, I'm curious if there's any sort of like foundational texts or things related to history sites, historic museums. I just feel like a lot of the conversations we're having, like museums silo themselves in a way too. Like I think art museums, history sites, children's museums, science museums, like we can all pull a lot. And some of us like use frameworks and pedagogies that might be like the others don't know about, that could be useful. And I'm curious if y'all have done work kind of around that. Like I'm almost thinking about relevancy in terms of larger capital I institution of museums as a whole, and like how can we all learn from each other? VTS was one example pulled that I guess historic sites can do. For me, I think historic sites are really great at evaluating exhibitions, and art museums, to be honest, just suck at that. And so like, do you all get what I'm trying to say? Like, what is the relevance of capital I institutions, museums, and how can we all help each other more as like an exchange or framework? That's kind of what I'm thinking about, because we all are wanting to answer these questions around how do we know what we know and what we don't know, but we all just do it differently. And I guess, why do we separate that out?
People are thinking.
I think what you said makes a whole lot of sense. And to me, paints a very cool picture of an ideal. I think there are a few things that that prevents us from doing that, but I don't think those obstacles necessarily have to be barriers. I would equate it to how you can have a country of people who are as diverse as we all are, and we still can't be on the same page as to what is the role of government and individual in the life of the individual, right? Or even in a bigger sense, you know, how do we balance the needs of the individual versus the needs of the collective? The mask is a perfect example. Like I think oftentimes what happens is the little things that separate us prevent us from seeing the we before the me. And it's been difficult. I chair the ASLH Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and we've started to reach out to other just history organizations that do, you know, that have D&I work, you know, AAAM, you know, AAM, NCPH, you know, so on. And I'm wrestling with the same thing, is how do we tear down the barriers? So one of the things just recently is ASLH is now using the definitions that AAM has put out. And the reason why is because I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. And two, history practitioners across the country, if we're going to try to deal with DEAI, let's at least use the same language. You can tell a lot about a people by the language they use, if they can speak the same language. So so I think it's just going to be it's, in order for something like that to happen, it's going to have to be intentional, and it's going to have to largely rest in a lot of the member-based organizations that have history, science, you know, all of these different types of museums incorporated. I'm here in Virginia, and so the Virginia Association of Museums is always reminding us of the diversity of museums, you know, in Virginia. And so if we start to see more of that, I think we'll really start to get some legs underneath that idea. But I think what you just stated is the ideal that I hear talked about often. The question always is, who are the volunteers at these volunteer-based organizations who are going to dedicate the time to try to bridge those gaps? We shall see. I think there's a new energy coming out of a lot of this too. So, but I'm writing it down because there may be a blog post on that soon.
Nah, I'm so psyched for that, because I've been thinking, like, where does dreaming come into play in terms of relevancy? And I'm just thinking, shoot, what if there's a new AAM, a new NAHL? Sorry, I should know it. But I don't know. I'm not trying to like burn bridges or anything. I'm just saying, like, what does it mean to have like real partnerships in that sense? And I don't know. I love going to these. I love learning from y'all historic sites, because it's like, it's fun for me, you know.
Good. Thank you. Good point.
Do we have any science museums represented? No.
Yeah.
I used to work for one.
Would you say there's a big difference in how they approach their content from history?
Well, I worked at a smaller science museum where the emphasis was a lot with hands-on and using like building exhibits with everyday materials. So there was lots of stuff with like hair dryers and ping pong balls and like ways that showed how science directly relates to things you're interacting with on a daily basis. So like they did kind of bake that sense of relevance straight into their exhibit design.
And also the process. I think they're ahead of history museums as far as conveying the scientific process.
Yeah.
I think we can take lessons from them.
When I was at the Minnesota Historical Society, we had a program that we were putting together with the Science Museum of Minnesota. Oh my gosh, I learned so much by that process because of how they do what they do. And so I think, I saw cross-pollination. I think the sort of cross-pollination would be really advantageous for everybody. Because their exhibit design is on point, and evaluation. Thank you, Heather. Absolutely. They do a wonderful job, I think, in their evaluations. And I think we got some room for growth.
I was just going to say that archaeology museums sit between disciplines. They sit sort of between history and science. And having worked in that field and also within astrophysics, there's a different process. There's a different way of explaining oneself, and there's a whole different set of funders and donors associated with those scientific fields too. There's this wow factor to the technology and the discovery that just in comparison and sitting in both places over the last couple of years, history's got a little bit of work to do to make that wow factor really click for audiences. And I think sessions like this are really great at explaining that relevancy and leading us back toward the wow wonderment piece.
I was also thinking two things. One, to Olivia's question, how much are we trapped by our own material culture? That, this need to, this stuff versus the science museum that doesn't necessarily have a collection, right? Or the children's museum that needs to create and change on the one hand. And the other, I was thinking, Richard, back to the short, very brief conversation we had about logic models, is it that we don't really know in sort of history museums and the historical world sometimes what it is what's the impact we're trying to have? Like, we're just telling a story, or, this is interesting. Here's this old guy's house and his stuff and whatever, without any real definition around what's the impact we're trying to have, what are the outcomes we're trying to create. And therefore, we don't have to ever evaluate anything beyond, did people like it? Right? Which is a legitimate level of evaluation, but, did people like it? Were they satisfied?
Yeah.
Now, if we want to be serious and go to the next level, I think evaluation is the next where we need to focus more. History museums need to, NEH and IMLS build evaluation into their grants, but certainly NSF is more rigorous and requires more rigorous evaluation. And it seems we have to find good ways to measure if we are relevant. It's easy to say, oh yeah, I'm relevant, but you need to be able to show that you're relevant. And how do you show that? That's, I think, what we're grappling with at the moment. I might be wrong, but.
Oh no, I think you're spot on, and that's why I continue to preach to people Randy Korn and her work on impact, museums and intentionality. Like, I hate saying intentionality because it's starting to become a buzzword. It feels like it's starting to become a buzzword, but the reality is that
here's our book.
There it is. That's the gold work right there. That's the gold work. I've read through it twice, and like I told a group earlier, in the appendix, I think it's Appendix A, she has a framework. Like, I took it and scanned it and created my own template, so that anytime I'm getting ready to go into a project, this is the first thing that I want to do. Is I want to identify what is our desired impact, and then from there, when we identify that, then we can go into our logic model and start going through that process. And those are the first two things that we have to that I'm suggesting that people do at the very early stages when you're getting ready to fill out for a grant. Like, know what kind of impact you're trying to have, and be clear about that.
I just happened to think that we in history museums and historic sites I believe, have it even tougher right now because what's being done to us is history is being made less relevant because it's not taught as much in schools as it used to be. Another challenge for us
Yeah.
is on us even more to try to teach because it's not being taught as much in schools. And how do we make it relevant when a lot of public schools in particular don't find it that relevant? That they're not offering as many classes, for instance, that kids aren't taking as many history courses. They're not required to, say, as math or science or whatever.
Well, one question we had is why is there no national organization for history? Like there's Americans for the Arts, there's one for science, but there isn't one for history. Why is that? So, but that's a really big question.
Can I ask one question? And Richard, you may know, or Tim, or somebody may know. I'm curious to know if this topic of relevancy, is it being taught in museum studies programs now?
That's a good question. I used to do this session at History Leadership Institute, if you know HLI, which is used to be SHA, if you know that program, which is ASLH and others. So they're acknowledging it. And I used to be invited to different local university programs, museum studies, to talk about relevance. But I don't, my guess is it's not on a regular basis. Richard, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I would say the same. I think, in certain, and there's certain, classrooms and and learning environments where it does exist, but the reason why it exists is because of the History Relevance campaign. And like the relationships that we have, within that campaign and how it's permeated, some rooms, but not others. So it's really sort of, relational. We have a few members who are academics. And so within their programs, they're able to, affect and, some change and incorporate it there, but it's not as widespread. The relationship that we had with the University of Minnesota, at the time frame that the Minnesota Historical Society established this really strong relationship with the University of Minnesota in 2013, 2014, History Relevance campaign was relevance is being talked about. And as there was some more traction that was gained, we started to see how relevance was incorporated into the public history courses that they had just built up. But that was, largely because, we had an executive director and, and senior directors who were really tied in with ASLH, and ASLH is very closely connected to relevance. So a lot of it is really about, it's an extension of the relationships rather than, some of this other stuff. Oh, Gail, you're right. Let me go get that right now.
Richard, you can also send it to me, and I can send it to the follow-up email.
Okay. Yes, I will do that.
So no big rush right now. So.
Okay. Yes, I'll do that. Thank you for reminding. And
just eventually, please. It would be wonderful reading.
No, and one other thing that I'll say, and it's a little personal, but I think it's relative in this conversation, is just recently I've started to I have an assessment next week to see if I have ADHD, and what I've been thinking about in the last 6 months when I've been digging into what ADHD is, and as I think about relevance, is let's just continue to think about mental health and mental conditions as we think about the relative nature of the stories that we tell. And it's not just that, okay, let's talk about, people who had attention, issues in the past. It's not necessarily about that. It's also, as you all were saying earlier, the means by which how we present the content that might make it relative too. So for the last several months now, I've been really kind of retooling how I talk or how I present things, because I'm now becoming, more aware that what we always traditionally think of as normal, like I don't think there is normal. I think we're all just uniquely distinct, and there isn't a normal and abnormal. Because every time I talk to somebody about ADHD, you say, wait, I do that too. It's like, I know. When my fiance told me about it, because she has ADHD, I was looking at her saying, oh yeah, I do that too. And then as we continue to have more conversations, I was like, okay. And then my therapist told me I needed to get assessed. I was like, okay. And so just, something else to think about when we're thinking about this sort of, this sort of piece is, don't forget that we all don't think the same. Our brains don't necessarily work the same, especially when we're talking about design and how to connect with people.
We're out of time, but I hope you found this valuable, and I hope you will take some time and look at the historyrelevance.com website and really spend some time looking at the value of history statement. I hope you'll take it to your organization and talk with them about it and share ideas on it. And if you feel inclined, it'd be great if you endorsed it and add your name to the other endorsers on the list there. There's still value in that. We don't expect anything of you, but it's just a public statement saying this is a good tool and we find it useful. Richard and I'm sure, I can't speak for him, but I'm sure he would love to talk more about relevance with you if you want to contact us. You took off our contact page, Richard, so I put it.
Oh, sorry.
Put it in the chat.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
I can also send it out in the email. So.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, I do want to thank Tim and Richard today. You presented a lot. I am glad that everybody stayed with us today. That was amazing. Great conversation. Yes, I could share the PowerPoint too, because Tim did send that to me earlier. I just want to remind everybody that we do have a call for proposals for our annual conference this November. We are virtual again. So definitely take a look at the website for information on how to submit a session. The deadline is June 11th.
Yeah, and if you feel the need to bounce ideas off anyone, I am here for that. My email is further up the chat, but I'll type it in one more time, or you can find it on the NEMA website. I'm happy to talk through conference proposal ideas if you want a sounding board before you submit your proposal.
Yep, and definitely take a look at our website. I think everybody's on our mailing list for upcoming webinars and stuff.
Very cute cat.
And if you want to learn from science museums, there's an awesome lunch with NEMA tomorrow about how to do traveling workshops and adapt things that you used to do in the classroom for a relevant virtual experience. So if you want to learn from some science methodology, sign up for tomorrow's free lunch with NEMA webinar.
Thank you, everyone, for your attention.
One quick last thing. If you look in your chat on the far side, it might say to everyone, and it says file, and it has the 3 buttons beside it. If you don't know, click on the 3 buttons, and what you'll see is at the top of that kind of list, you can click on the save chat. And everything that's in the chat, it'll save into a file for you. So you have that information as well. If there's something that came up in the chat that you want to save. I just realized that I just recently, and I'm like, after every webinar or whatnot I do, there's a whole lot of stuff in the chat that I didn't get to write down or whatnot. So I just tell people, hey, save the chat, and then you got it, at your fingertips. But good to see everybody, and thank you all much, and have a great week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.